So in previous lessons, we spent some time talking about the 1955 general election, the positive win for the Conservative Party, the sort of general atmosphere of the country at the time of the election. And now we're going to start to think a little bit about the period of the affluent society, if you will, where we are talking about Anthony Eden as Prime Minister. Now, Anthony Eden, for all intents and purposes, was an individual who should have had the most popular tenureship, shall we say, of most post-war prime ministers, given the fact that he was somebody who succeeded Winston Churchill as prime minister in April 1955, but who will only be in office until January 1957. He himself was educated at Eton and Oxford. He served as Foreign Secretary 3 times under Baldwin, Churchill, and then again between 1951 and 1955. He contributed quite significantly to a number of foreign policy endeavours prior to the start of the Second World War. So, for example, in 1936, he negotiated the Suez Canal Treaty. He mediated tensions between Italy and Yugoslavia. He also was involved in the formation of NATO, as well as the 1954 Geneva Conference on Indochina, as well as involved in the Anglo-Iranian oil dispute resolution, which, again, none of this you really need to know that much about, but it gives you a bit of context of Anthony Eden's sort of pre-war and sort of pre-period we're studying understanding of him as a prime minister. But you would look at this sort of resume, if you will, look at this CV of Anthony Eden prior to him taking office as Prime Minister, and you would think that he was going to be a particularly successful Prime Minister, especially when it comes to the eras and the area of foreign policy, given that he was Foreign Secretary for so long and involved in international issues for so long, which is just very ironic given that it was his foreign policy that really marked the end of his tenureship and his downfall. So we can see that what happens just before the Second World War is that in 1938 he resigns as Foreign Secretary, getting correct the policy of appeasement that Chamberlain had implemented as being the wrong policy towards Hitler and Mussolini, and seeing the writing on the wall and resigning in opposition to that. But then when we sort of jump ahead to him as Prime Minister, he becomes Prime Minister in April 1955, and he calls for a general election in May, immediately calls for a general election, and increases his vote share to 49.7% of the popular vote, which we noted in the previous video, getting around a 60-seat majority in the House of Commons as well. Now, fundamentally, he's not in office for very long before his ultimate downfall will be brought to the fold. Now, we will talk about the Suez Crisis as its own separate video when we look at foreign policy for this chapter for the A-level in history. But safest to say that it's very simple. Fundamentally, we see the rise into power through a military coup of the Egyptian president Gamal Abdel Nasser, and as part of Nasser's policy of both anti-Zionism and anti-colonialism, he takes a quite aggressive stance against the newly founded State of Israel, of course, which was founded in 1948 and was founded following a war with Egypt and a number of other Arab countries. But he's also anti-colonial in the sense that he does not accept and does not very much like the presence of British and French colonial forces or colonial administrators in and around the Suez Canal. And so in July 1956, we see that Gamal Abdel Nasser takes the bold step of nationalizing the Suez Canal, which basically means taking the Suez Canal under the control of the Egyptian government. So basically taking control of the Suez Canal. Now, this, of course, triggered Eden in both his... it triggered him to both respond, and it also triggered him personally, let's just say, fundamentally. And he saw Nasser, and he viewed Nasser as a sort of new Hitler or a new Mussolini. And he believed that the nationalization of the Suez Canal would threaten British oil access to and also Middle Eastern influence. And so he agrees a secret tripartite collusion with Israel and France. This is known as the Protocol of Severus, and essentially was a planned military operation to retake the Suez Canal. He would deliberately conceal Parliament in the process of doing so, and he would sort of make it seem like that this was not a secret collusion, that the Israelis invaded and that they the French and the British sort of came along as sort of peacekeepers, when in reality they goaded the Israelis to invade and to take the Suez Canal and the Sinai Desert, and then to also invade themselves. Fundamentally, then, what does everybody get out of this collusion? Well, Britain and France obviously get the Suez Canal back and see it as a military victory. Israel gets the great power patronage that she has wanted ever since the 1948 war, given the fact that she's quite diplomatically isolated during this time. She doesn't have these big allies. She doesn't have the Soviet Union as an ally, or the United States as an ally, or Great Britain and France as allies. And so the Suez Crisis was seen as an opportune moment for them to take or to gain themselves some standing when it comes to the sort of international community, or the community of great powers, if you will. The invasion begins on the 5th of November 1956. British and French forces make initial gains, especially around around Port Said, and they mount a global opposition. But global opposition essentially reduces their ability to carry on much further. International backlash was quite unprecedented. The United States, under President Eisenhower, refused both financial support and military support for the invasion. Now, Eisenhower had a number of reasons why he did not want the Suez Crisis to carry on. The first is that it was November 1956, there is a presidential election going on. He doesn't want this to be an issue running into the presidential election. The second point is that the Middle East, for the majority of the Cold War, is in a bit of a tricky situation. It's been a bit of a sticky situation in the sense that a lot of Middle Eastern countries were what were known as non-aligned countries, i.e. they were not aligned either to the Soviet Union or to the United States, the sort of communist powers or the capitalist powers during the Cold War. Now, the non-aligned movement had a number of countries, including Egypt at one point, and other countries such as Yugoslavia, which it was sort of a bit of a facade, in the sense that the non-aligned movement tended to be more aligned to the Soviets than would be to the United States, by and large. And so there was this real fear that the Suez Crisis could draw Arab countries especially towards the Soviet sphere of influence, and basically turn the Middle East into a pro-Soviet zone, which of course Eisenhower and the Americans did not want. And especially given the fact that Israel, of all countries, was the one that was also involved in military force and invading the Suez, which, of course, there's been hostilities ever since 1947, 1948 with Israel and all the other Arab countries, meant that this might have even brought more, if the Americans were seen to have been supporting the Israelis at this point, it might have brought more Arab countries into the sphere of influence of the Soviets. And so the result of which is that the US blocked IMF funding, they pressured sterling, and they also demanded a ceasefire. Without US backing, Eden's venture was basically fundamentally unsustainable. Now, in terms of the United Nations as well, the United Nations, the Soviet Union, and many domestic critics condemned the invasion. The Labour Party, Hugh Gaitskell, accused Eden of acting unilaterally and misleading Parliament. And this was just one of the couple of issues that is associated with the resignation and the end of Eden as Prime Minister. Eden also had significant health problems. So his health was severely compromised after a botched abdominal operation in 1953, leading to chronic pain and dependency on amphetamines and other kinds of barbiturates, which affected his performance, of course, in judgment, and also during the months of the crisis, undermined his ability to operate as an effective prime minister. By late 1956, while he was abroad for health reasons, I believe in the Caribbean, Harold Macmillan, who was somebody who was increasingly wielding more influence in cabinet, began to take control of the situation, and Eden's political capital at this point was beginning to exhaust, to which point on the 9th of January 1957, Eden would resign officially due to his ill health, but also because he had political isolation and no one really gave him any kind of confidence. And so when we think about the sort of legacy of Anthony Eden, historians generally regard him as one of the least successful British prime ministers of the 20th century, maybe even one of the least successful British prime ministers of all time. Of course, he might have been first place in that list until Liz Truss came along, of course. But despite having a very long and distinguished foreign policy career, it is ironic that it was exactly in foreign policy that really he was overshadowed because of his failure during the Suez Crisis.